Yes, if you'd like, I'll just take a moment to say thank you to Amanda, actually, for putting this together and spending the last few months liaising with us at BARS to organize this fantastic panel. And I'm sure it will be a very exciting roundtable. And we're just so delighted that you've brought it to us and to our audience here at BARS. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosalind. Our pleasure. Um, well, welcome everyone to this British Association for Romantic Studies digital event to celebrate the publication of Volume 4 of the Complete Poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley. I've got my copy here. Edited by Nora Crook, Neil Freistadt, Stephen Behrendt, and the late Stuart Curran, and published by Johns Hopkins University Press. I'm Amanda Blake Davis, and I'm delighted to be chairing this event this evening. I'm especially glad to be joined by a luminary group of panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a few moments. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the executive of the British Association for Romantic Studies for continuing to bridge romantic studies across time and place through their digital event series. And in particular, I'd like to thank Rosalind Irving, Matt Sangster, and Amy Wilcoxon, and the BARS communications team for their support with this event. This evening's event will be a roundtable full of exciting discoveries related to Volume 4 of the Complete Poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley, and reflections upon the man and the poet. So I will ask our panelists to keep their cameras on throughout the event. I ask the audience to please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted during the event. If you wouldn't mind just checking that your camera's off and your microphone muted, just in order to limit disruptions. Everyone is very much encouraged to use the chat box throughout this event, as many of you have been doing already, sharing the weather and your locations. And there will be a Q&A at the end of this event where you will have the opportunity to unmute yourself and appear on screen if you so wish to ask a question. You may type questions into the chat box at any point during this event, and we will pick them up during the Q&A at the end, or you may use the raise hand function during the Q&A. If you encounter any technical difficulties at all, please do type into the chat box for assistance, or contact me directly, or Rosalind or Matt are here from BARS to help us as well. This event is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to the BARS Digital Events YouTube channel, which I strongly encourage you to check out. So without any further ado, it's a great honor to introduce this evening's panelists. Stephen Behrendt recently retired from the University of Nebraska, where he was the George Holmes Distinguished University Professor of English. Steve has published widely over his career on his varied interests, which include, in addition to the Shelleys, of course, William Blake, the Wordsworths, and especially during the past 2 decades, Romantic-era women poets of the British Isles, including Ireland. In addition to numerous edited collections, he has published books on Blake, on Shelley, including, of course, the superb Shelley and his audiences, and on the cultural phenomena surrounding the death of Princess Charlotte Augusta in 1817. More recently, in 2009, he published British Women Poets and the Romantic Writing Community with Johns Hopkins University Press, and in 2021, Cork University Press published his 600-plus page critical anthology, Romantic-Era Irish Women Poets in English. Steve is also a widely published poet whose publications include 4 book-length collections, and we will have the great privilege this evening of hearing one of his poems. Madeleine Callaghan is Senior Lecturer in Romantic Literature at the University of Sheffield. Her first monograph, Shelley's Living Artistry, Letters, Poems, Plays, came out in 2017, and her monograph, The Poet Hero in the Work of Byron and Shelley, was published in 2019. With Michael O'Neill, she co-authored the Romantic Poetry Handbook, published in 2018, and with Anthony Howe, she edited Romanticism and the Letter. Her most recent book, Eternity in British Romantic Poetry, came out in 2022. She is the co-president of the International Byron Society and is currently working on a new edition of Percy Shelley's works for Oxford University Press. Nora Crook is best known to us all as a romanticist with expertise on both the Shelleys. She is the general editor of the Pickering and Chatto edition of Mary Shelley's works and co-general editor on the Hopkins edition of Percy Shelley since 2012 with Neil Freistadt. Volume 7, published out of sequence in 2021, for which she was the editor, was noted for its foregrounding of Mary Shelley's editing of Shelley's posthumous poems. Nora is Jamaican and came from there to study at Cambridge, where she settled, teaching first in a primary school and adult literacy, and then at what became Anglia Ruskin University, where she is now Professor Emerita. I'm just pausing because I can see there's a comment in the chat saying my volume is coming off and on, so I might try just removing my headset. Could someone in the chat let me know if you can hear me now, if that's any better?
You sound perfectly audible to me.
Perfect. Thank you for letting me know. Right, so I'm very sorry to have to say that Neil Freistadt, who is a co-founder with Donald Ryman of the edition, the Hopkins edition, and has been with the edition throughout the 5 volumes since 2000, when volume 1 first appeared, can't be with us this evening. Neil is awaiting an operation for chronic sinusitis and apologizes to everyone, but he just isn't well enough to attend. Please do join me in wishing him a speedy recovery. Neil has left a message which Nora is going to read on his behalf, so I hand over now to Nora to introduce the magisterial Johns Hopkins edition and her fellow editors.
Thank you so much, Amanda. As a lot of you know, the Hopkins edition was founded, it was conceived by Don and Neil in the late 1980s as a result of all the new material that was beginning to emerge from the transcriptions of Shelley's manuscript notebooks in the Bodleian, an immense project, which and it also extended to Swiss collection libraries and American libraries having Shelley manuscript. And it was led by Don Ryman, and it's under his general editorship. And eventually it was finished in 1997, all this transcription work. Anyway, he and Neil planned this as an 8-volume set, and it stayed this way. And the first volume came out in 2000, but progress slowed up because of Don's illness. And as Amanda explained, volume 7 came out ahead of the rest. So volume 4 is the 5th to come out, and so we're now over the halfway mark. Hooray! And speeding up. And it has 4-volume editors. And the way it works is that as general editors, Neil and I worked with all the other volume editors, and everybody pitched in. But the person actually named as the editor of this or that work makes the final call. But you can take it that we all acted as contributors in some sense. And Steve was responsible for Peter Bell III and the political poems of 1819, other than Mask, for which Stuart was responsible. I was responsible for Athenais, Julian and Maddalo, and the shorter lyrics. And, well, we have about Stuart's contribution. And we continue to feel the great absence of Michael O'Neill, who was to have edited the lyrics, but who sadly died, as many of you know, in 2018. And then 2 new members have recently joined the team, and that's Madeleine and Amanda. And they've helped enormously with the production of volume 4. And they've been getting on with some key poems for volume 5. And this will be for the second Shelley Annus Mirabilis, the 1820, because this one is largely confined to 1818 to 1819. And we may have a little time ahead to have a peek at what's in the pipelines, or perhaps that may be the subject of the chat. And I want to thank also all the librarians who helped us so much. I mean, what one would do without them. And it's invidious to single out names, but there's the legendary Bruce Barker Benfield, and his successor Stephen Hebron, Liz Denlinger, curator of the Port Cymer, Doucette Devin Fisher, editor of Shelley and His Circle, and Charles Kuykendall Carter. And it just would have been impossible without them. But anyway, to the present volume. I mean, the move to Italy in 1880 really is the start of new developments for Shelley. The Italian landscape enters into his work, the things he's really seen, not just read in Gothic novels or travel books. And he cements this ambivalent friendship with Byron. There's a lot of Byron in this volume. And he experiments with all kinds of genres and styles. And then, while he's in Italy, Peterloo comes as a terrific shock. And out of this anger and boiling rage, he writes some of his most hard-hitting political poetry of his career, and satires, which you don't associate with Shelley normally. And as Steve notes in his commentary to Peter Bell, his energy during the year 1819, and particularly during the latter part, is astonishing. And he begins to become a European. And it's volume 4, as you saw, is dedicated to the memory of Stuart, who died on just over a year ago, 7th October 1824, of a brain tumor that suddenly struck in May 2024, shortly before he was due to attend the Shelley conference at Keats House. And he had said previously to his husband of 57 years, Joe Whitfrag, "I am looking forward to meeting all the young scholars." And shortly before this happened, he put his very final touches to the editorial work for the current volume. So he never did meet all the young scholars. And I know this was a regret for all of us. And he was in charge of Rosalind and Helen, Lines Written Among the Ugandan Hills, the Cenci, and the Mask of Honor. But he carefully reviewed everyone's commentaries in the volume before it was sent to press. And so this is the last piece of academic work that he completed, and it's a legacy. But he also left behind notes on all the 4 acts of Prometheus Unbound. And these are going to be incorporated into volume 5. He was a great lover of things Italian, and he took particular zest in the work he did for volume 4. And he was a wonderful teacher, encouraging, supportive, kind, and with exacting standards. All his students say this. Neil had been his PhD student, and it was Neil who persuaded him to join the team after his retirement. And Neil writes, few scholars of the past 50 years have been more consequential to the study of the Shelleys. His 2 books on Shelley, Shelley's Cenci, Scorpions Ringed with Fire, and Shelley's Animus Mirabiles, are foundational for later criticism. His editing of the Cenci in this volume fittingly rounds off the work he initiated with the first, which made him a star of the Romantic firmaments. He published path-breaking works. His editorial work on women writers of the Romantic era, particularly Charlotte Smith, and his hypertext edition of Frankenstein, and on the University of Pennsylvania's English department website. I guess a lot of you know about these and have used them. And his poetic form and British Romanticism is an essential on many Romanticist bookshelves. His involvement with the Hopkins Shelley began in the late 2000s with the preparation of Volume 3. And by Volume 4, we were having monthly editorial Zoom meetings, which were lit up by the gleam in his eyes when he was about to deliver one of his witticisms and his chortle after it was delivered. It was as though we had become the close community of friends bound on their joyous voyage in Shelley's Sonnet from the Italian of Dante, one of Stuart's favourites. We profoundly miss his immense learning, his critical intelligence, his nuanced understanding of Shelley's verse, his wise counsel, and his humour. And that's what Neil wrote for this. Now you can see something of that, Stuart, if you Google Shelley 2000 Epipsychidion, which is another of the Bar's roundtables. And that came out in 2021, and it's on YouTube, and should take you to the recording, which commemorates the bicentenary of Epipsychidion with Will Bowers, Mike Rossington, Valentina, and Bishkoffi, who was the convener. And now I turn to Steve, who knew Stuart for 50 years. And over to you now, Steve.
Thank you, Nora. I did the math, and it's actually closer to 60, I fear to say. I met Stuart and Joe Whitrick both in 1967. I was their student, their mentee, and it's one of the great joys of my life to say that I've been a lifelong friend of both of them. Stuart was the consummate scholar, the consummate gentleman, the consummate teacher, and it's no exaggeration to say that everything I've done as a scholar and as a teacher is much in debt to Stuart and Joe. When Stuart retired from University of Pennsylvania, the department out there put together a little fest for him. And they invited former students and colleagues to come and take part in what turned into a Stuart Fest. There was a break in the action, and some of us went out to stretch our legs. It was a sort of a rainy, misty day, springtime in Philadelphia. And I ended up writing a poem which has sat in my files for many years. This is something that is coming out for the first time today, and I can't think of a better occasion to share it with you. This is called Locust Walk Idle. There are lots of locust streets and locust trees in Philadelphia. Locust Walk Idle for Stuart Curran. They bear rich weight of time and place, these locust-lined walkways moist with humid air, ragged draperies of showers that nourish new grass, hyacinth blooming near the staid stone buildings where scholars passed already, old and young, before these trees were planted, thrived, stretched toward Pennsylvania sky, Penn's woods, long since hewn, dismissed into paintings hung in airtight rooms and passageways where passive eyes inspect without seeing, silent. This urban greensward pauses, hushed, sounds muffled like the stealthy paws of the sturdy gray squirrels, by the trees, the heavy blooms, winding walks, rain-glazed. Even the passing students move subdued beneath umbrellas, ponchos, the breath of conversation slow, exhaling without urgency in the soft spring showers as they trace their slow lines from hall to hall, past green-hued walls and mansard roofs that have known the rains, the snows, the heat of summer thick and clinging with salt Atlantic air. Inside, all is rainbow, is festal, radiant with joy in league with love, warm, sunlit despite the gray panes their south faces streaming. Is celebration, is fond familiar spirits who laugh and remember, savoring this good friend we celebrate, right into the record of our affection, inscribe anew, like the tiger, joy in our diverse ways. How long we have basked in this generous sun and parsed the ways of learning, making partial payment now on the richly veined gold he has lent us, lovingly. That was Stuart, and everyone who knew him, remembers him, and will always love him. Thank you. Nora, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for that. Yeah, I just feel very moved. Anything, Madeleine, you want, or shall we move on?
I didn't have a chance to know Stuart for nearly as long, but one thing I do remember is being an incredibly, and I'm not much more significant now than I was, but a very insignificant little snip of a thing. And Stuart being so wonderfully kind, patient, amused and amusing, and always you felt wishing you well in everything you did. He'd always be the man with the great question. He'd always be the man that would push your thinking further. But just such kindness in someone so intelligent and so interested in others. There are so many people that go and don't hear what others say, or they don't, those passive eyes, Steve, that you describe in your poem. And Stuart was all activity, all kindness, all love. He was that Shelleyan universal sun in many ways. And I think that his mark on our field and beyond will be very difficult to ever surpass. Thank you.
Thank you all for such moving reflections and for sharing that poem with us, Steve. I don't know if you saw it, but the video screen was filled with reactions of people clapping and sending hearts to you. So it clearly moved in the audience as well. I never had the opportunity. Oh, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No, I just said it's very kind. I appreciate that.
I never had the opportunity to meet Stuart, but Shelley's Annus Mirabilis, his study of Shelley's miraculous period from early autumn 1818 to the beginning of 1820, certainly had an impact on me at the very start of my PhD on Shelley. I'm confident it's a study which has had a profound impact upon all of us, hence our adaptation of it in this event's title. Where volume 4 covers compositions from those miraculous years of Shelley's life from 1818 to early 1820. In particular, Stuart's description of his immersion in Shelley's Huntington notebooks in the Huntington Library and Art Gallery in that book's preface left an impression on me and instilled in me, I think, the vital significance of Shelley's manuscripts to my readings and to his published works. To experience through the notebooks the living evidence of Shelley's genius, Stuart writes, has resurrected with a new intensity some questions that insistently demanded answers beyond the range of his previous study, Shelley's Cenci, Scorpions Ringed with Fire. And of course, Stuart's editing of the Cenci is one of his lasting achievements in this latest Hopkins edition. If there's no further reflections, Nora or Steve or Maddie, then shall we move on to our roundtable discussion, certainly in Stuart's memory and honour?
Yeah, please do, Amanda.
Great. So we'll turn now to the roundtable portion of this evening's event with discussion between our panelists. If you in the audience have any questions you wish to ask during the course of the roundtable, if you're excited or inspired by what our panelists are saying, please feel free to type these into the chat box and we'll pick them up in the Q&A at the end of the event. So my first question to pose to you, Nora and Steve in particular, is the generic diversity of this volume is very marked. How did you balance the claims of works as different as the Cenci, Peter Bell III, and those saddest lyrics? Did you approach them differently, or did you try and approach them in a uniform way?
I'd say there's more diversity than uniformity. I mean, we always pay attention to genre, Amanda, in our commentaries. And so, of course, the commentaries themselves point up these differences. And because we have a diversity of editors, will always be a diversity of perspectives. And there's, of course, a Johns Hopkins house style, and it's very complicated. But we don't impose uniformity of the way that we edit the text. I mean, for instance, if we're editing a poem from a press copy, it'll look a bit rougher than one edited from one of Shelley's printed texts, especially one that he supervised himself and saw through the press. But we don't try to simulate a manuscript. For instance, some of the press copies will have Shelley putting, instead of asterisks, a sort of little forest of things that look like an X. Well, there's no way of representing them in print as they are. And anyway, it's clear he meant an asterisk. So we put an asterisk. We follow the actual print convention. and we don't have a rule saying that if a poem is long, it's got the commentary is going to be proportionately long. And similarly, short poems will have to have short commentaries. For instance, a good example is Steve's editing of the sonnet England in 1819. And it's only 14 lines, but it's a terrifically rich poem. And there's a slew of contested contestations about the final 2 lines, which is very interesting. And Steve's commentary is therefore quite long, given that it's a sonnet, and rightly too, because it's able to do justice to the richness and the importance of the poem and its contested critical history. But I don't know, Stephen, did you did you feel that there was a kind of were you aware of a sort of uniformity imposed, or what? What's your take on this?
I think we all took our individual contributions and worked from our own attitudes, our own approaches. Certainly, we were conscious of genre, but one of the things that I was reminded of in working on the England in 1819 was just the tremendous amount of material that Shelley would bring to bear on everything. And one of the things that I find in looking at Shelley is his wit, his sheer sense of fun is underestimated, and it tends to poke out at unusual times. And I think that one of the things that we couldn't accommodate in our volume is the wealth of visual material that's out there, the caricature prints of the period, the things that appeared in the radical press, the street theater of the time, of the protest movements. The volume that was done on Peterloo a couple of years ago by Michael Dempson, and I've forgotten now, I'm blanking, but brought together all kinds of things about material culture that are not normally part of what we look at when we do strict literary textual analysis. It seems to me that the approaches that we took to other poems in the volume were adjusted just as well in terms of an audience who actually got those texts and intended audiences. Certainly what Stewart did with the Cenci pays attention to this tremendous diversity of intention and source material and how it's being handled. That's a tangential comment, but I think working with Shelley, one is always working with tangents because, as I said, there's just so many things coming and going in all of his lines. And when you have a chance to look at the manuscripts and the notebooks and the changes and the evolution of lines, you really begin to see how much he was processing, putting it in. Does this work? Do I want that reference? Take it out, move it around. It's a totally dynamic kind of writing that then is put in a very finite form when it finally goes to press.
And I think too that one of the things that all we can do is to, when there's an awful lot of visual material, I think we do cite more URLs. One of the problems we found was that some of the URLs were going out of date. They appeared and then they disappeared, and that is really a problem. We are as up to date as we can. I mean, all the things we refer people to online were live as of when we did them, but it's not always going to work. And however, we manage, and at least we let people know that there is this wealth of material. For instance, Stewart refers readers to Michael Dempson's a graphic novel about Mask of Anarchy, and lots of things like that as much as we can, when appropriate, of course.
Fantastic. Yeah, I've just seen that Matt's put Michael Dempson's book into the chat there just before you mentioned Nora. That's great. I suppose if I might push that question just a tiny bit further, because I find it so interesting, this generic diversity that we have in Volume 4, and especially, Steve, your mention of Shelley's audience versus intended audience is fascinating, especially coming from you. I mean, in this volume, in Volume 4, we have so many of Shelley's greatest hits, to put it, if I might put it that way, The Mask of Anarchy, Ozymandias. So these works that are having a kind of contemporary moment and that are highly quotable in our contemporary moment. So I'm thinking of An Old, Mad, Blind, Despised, and Dying King of England in 1819, Year Many, They Are Few, of course. And I'm not sure who here has seen the new Frankenstein film by Guillermo del Toro, but Ozymandias certainly has a moment in that film. So there seems to be a steering between these poems for the populace and for more private audiences, if I might, especially when we think about lyrics like the ones to Sophia Stacey. So could the both of you, Steve and Nora, could you speak a bit more about how Shelley steers between these modes, between audiences in Volume 4 in particular?
Well, he steers between, but he's looking at both what he called the esoteric and the exoteric readers. He's looking at both all the time, and he moves with remarkable facility between the idioms of very high, the traditional high romantic poetry, and the street, the broadside ballad. And it's very interesting to see how one will turn up in the other. There's a remarkable flexibility, and when you consider that he's working on all of these things more or less simultaneously, to be able to go from one idiom and one ethos and shift into another, and you see this in the way draft lines are intermixed in the manuscripts. He's working on something, and then he'll turn to something else. We all work like that, I suppose. We all have to multitask between our classes and our other obligations. But we forget that somebody like Shelley not only is working full-time on poetry and prose, but he's also highly active wherever he is. When they're in Italy, they're going out and they're seeing the ruins, and they're going to see Rossini operas and everything that's going on in the culture. This necessarily filters into and out of his poetry. And trying to do everything strictly by genre expectations can be very frustrating with a poet whose work inherently resists that kind of balkanization.
Mm-hmm. By the way, this is not a direct answer to the question, but Amanda, you mentioned Ozymandias. Yes, Ozymandias is there, but that brings, I'm going to use that as a hook to just illustrate a point about the Hopkins edition. Ozymandias is there, but it's there because it was in the volume that Shelley published in 1819, of which the lead poem was Rosalind and Helen. And very unusually, he said, I don't know what poems my bookseller is going to add. So, and he didn't actually choose the ones he was going to add to the volume. He went and just left it to Olia, his publisher, to put in what he could find. And so all really Olia had to go by was Hymn to Intellectual Beauty and Ozymandias, which had previously appeared in the Examiner, edited by Leigh Hunt, back in 1817 and early 1818. And so these two poems appear with collations fully commented on, and it's Michael and Neil's commentary that is there. And that's in volume 3. Here, they appear as part of the Rosalind and Helen volume, but without comments, just as the text. And the text is a bit different from the one in volume 3 because Peacock edited it. Shelley didn't really have anything to do with it. And it makes it, it's an interesting comparison. And it also makes one ask, 2 of the poems in that volume are set in Italy, but the others have a foot in England and his concerns in England before he left. And it's a very interesting hybrid volume. So if something has been published in 2 different publications, our policy is to try and publish them twice, and you see them in different contexts. But
Thank
without
you. Sorry, Nora, I don't want to disturb you. Go ahead. I was just going to say that's so fascinating to have that extra hybridization that we get across the Hopkins set, which makes it really distinctive, certainly as an addition, I think, getting these poems in different contexts. Was there anything further you wanted to add?
It also raises another issue, Amanda, because the next volume, volume 5, is going to have a couple of poems that the Victorian Shelley scholars poo-pooed and thought were totally beneath Shelley. The best example is one called A Ballad, which people like Foreman argued it's so awful it couldn't possibly have been by Shelley. Well, the fact is, not only was it by Shelley, but he was directly in the radical press idiom of the street broadside. And he does it well, I mean, the failed title of The Wasteland, he originally was going to call it He Do the Police in Different Voices, from a Dickens title. Shelley can do the poetry in different voices. He's good. But this raises the issue that's always out there then, well, who's Shelley? W-H-O-S-E. Which Shelley do we want to put up there? And to try to choose one over the other is to miss the sheer polyphony of the man.
I think that's an excellent point, Steve, for our next question, if we might consider multiple Shelleys or new directions for Shelley. So are there new directions for Shelley that come out of this volume, out of volume 4? Do we see Shelley developing new interests? Do his personal circumstances alter the poetry and drama?
Shall I back first? Oh, no, you go on.
Go ahead now. I'm going to defer to you because I love your idea about the fact that Shelley becomes a European in this volume.
To me, one of the very big things that happens in volume 4 is that we see Shelley taking a direction into becoming a dramatist. And it's not actually foreseeable or predictable, really. I mean, you can look and see foreshadowings and dramatic type works that in things he'd done before. But I don't think you'd have honestly said, I know that man's next thing he's going to move into his drama. And so there's something slightly happenstance accidental about this, and partly due he's reads Schlegel, he's taken to see the drama by Leigh Hunt and Peacock just before he leaves England. And he's realized just how important the theatre is to the cultural life of a nation and how it can gain audiences for one's work. And of course, as we know, the Cenci wasn't able to be put on the stage, though it was intended for the stage. And it got more reviews than any other of his poems, I think. Partly, in a bad way, it became notorious. And I remember that really very astute and acute critic, Richard Cronin, saying to me once that if Shelley had had a stage hit, the history of English 19th century drama would have been entirely different. Makes you think, eh? And of course, Shelley never stopped actually making a bit of a trier drama. And that is, of course, a later story. He tries again with the stage drama. But then he does Hellas, and he does unfinished drama. He's always trying to do drama after this period, I think.
I remember many years ago a Miltonist saying that the ascending rank is up through lyric, elegy, epic, and finally drama. And I wonder if there was something of that in Shelley, because even the non-dramatic works like Julian and Maddalo basically are drama.
Absolutely. And Mary Shelley goes and says that that he always pondered a drama. When he got to Italy, he was going to do one on Job. He then pondered the Prometheus Unbound, which was, she says, also. But yeah, he is. I say, in Julian and Maddalo, it's the most dramatic of his non-dramatic works, isn't it? The one that isn't really drama.
I've got some sympathy with that. I really do, that this idea of the hierarchy. But one thing I keep thinking about with Shelley is the pressure on the lyric that we see in this volume really coming through. I mean, you compare the kind of artfulness of the Sophia Stacey poems that to some people felt confessional up against the saddest lyrics. And I think Susan Wolfson uses a great phrase about Felicia Hemans. She calls it the calculus of heart and art. And I keep thinking about Shelley experimenting with that same sliding scale. What can you do? And just the kind of amount that he makes lyric do. I think, like Byron, who at the same time was rethinking that hierarchical understanding of the genres, I wonder if Shelley was also thinking, but what can a genre do? What can we put pressure on here? What can we expand outwards towards with a lyric? Like you say, Steve, he tends towards the dramatic so interestingly. And you might read these lyrics as, you know, that intense creation of a persona in some of them, and then intensely putting out the idea of a persona in others. He makes it so difficult for you to grasp onto any one idea that it's so hard to talk about a genre. We end up dealing with the singularity of each of these lyrics, even when they're a sequence.
And of course, he's also trying out doing narrative poems, and he blends this with the eclogue conventions, and he's trying out the familiar style, and again, the familiar style gets blended in with the eclogue, and thus also is mingled with the narrative. I mean, I think he feels very much narrative poetry is something that he wants to do and that other people can do better than him, like Scott and Byron. And he wants to try that out too. And he doesn't do anything that's really like Scott and Byron. He does something different.
On these generic minglings, and Maddie, because you brought up the Sophia Stacey poems in particular, I mean, could you speak to a sense of musicality and more that we have coming through in the Stacey poems?
Yeah, I'm very interested in Bernard Beattie's book on reading Byron argues that there are two kind of major prongs almost. He argues that Byron is underrated as a lyricist or as a poet because we've inherited this idea of visual poetry that's difficult in certain ways, and argues that Byron moves much more into the musical. I think we can see Shelley as working with Moore's musicality in fascinating ways here. You could argue that these are drawing room poems. I mean, for those of you, please do look at Nora's commentary on these. There's some fantastic stuff on just how carefully Shelley makes use of the musicality and how all of this sounds together. And I I can't help but being amazed at how well he could perform to each theme, and how well, much like Thomas More, who had an eye always to that drawing room where this would be performed, where a voice would matter, that Shelley is so, like Steve said, he's doing the police in different voices here. He is giving us a sophisticated, anacreontic understanding of how lyric can progress in the early 19th century. Honestly, I don't know that Byron, if you compare Hebrew melodies, which is a more obvious take on Moore's Irish melodies, I don't know that he actually delivers as much more as Shelley does in those lyrics to Sophia Stacey. Many may argue.
Well, coming from the Byronist like you,
Oh no, I knew I'm going to get arrested by the Byronites.
I listen, I pay attention to what you say.
The issue of music is really an interesting thing, and this is why nobody ever told me before I got serious about the research that he and Mary and their circle were frequenting all sorts of musical productions, including opera, when they were in Italy. And that begins to make many things make more sense to me, because I still think that Ode to the West Wind may be the most musical thing that he ever did. I mean, it reads just incredibly when you read it aloud with your students. It's like the phenomenon that we sometimes get teaching Shakespeare, where they cannot understand what's going on, they can't fathom the language, and we read it out, and everybody says, "Oh, yeah." There's that performative element in Shelley's work that is profoundly musical.
I mean, it's almost like we keep him returned in every single volume. You know, the way he speaks about voice. I mean, in so many poems, you could quote a fantastic line or stanza on the idea of voice. Even in the plays, it's there too. I feel that Shelley reminds us all the time that, you know, I was thinking about that Auden line, you know, a way of happening, a mouth that we get in Shelley's work that's so important and encompasses so many different types of voice. And Shelley kind of lets us think about mobility as a keynote thing for him.
To think about voice and Shelley, and kind of jumping off of Steve and Maddie, your points there, and the reader giving voice to Shelley through the act of reading aloud, is a nice transition, I think, to our next question. So what have you discovered about yourselves as readers, as scholars, editors, and as citizens of the increasingly volatile contemporary world during work on editing and reading this volume? I suppose I'll give Nora and Steve a break for a moment, Maddie, if you and I want to have a chat about this to start off with. I mean, we, as readers of some poems in this volume, came across stanzas written in dejection, and really that gave us a lot of pause, didn't it? In our volatile contemporary world, I mean, dejection seems a preeminent mood. I wonder if it's because of current circumstances that that poem had such a significant impact upon us. What did you make of proofreading stanzas written in dejection?
I've always loved the poem, and it's one that, interestingly, Steve and Nora both mentioned as a very specific favourite of Stuart Curran's as well. And I think what shocked me is, even in the midst of dejection, how Shelley could make such incredible aesthetic effect out of that. I mean, look at what he does with a Spenserian stanza here. I don't think there's many poets that would have the audacity, after Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, being friends with Byron in a period that he's having to be aware of Byron's apparent supremacy. And what does he do? He plays with it. He rethinks it. He makes it work differently. I did a bit of an experiment with my students and read them a stanza of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage 3 and a stanza of stanzas written in dejection. Not one of them thought it was the same poet. So that's at 20 years old, they're able to say there's no way. So Shelley puts a stamp on something so carefully and clearly. I mean, listen to this for presence. I see the deep's untrammeled floor, with green and purple seaweed strown. I see the waves upon the shore. like light dissolved and star showers thrown. I sit upon the sands alone. It's so simple, and it shouldn't work, should it? I mean, we have this absolute emphasis upon place. I see. So straight away, people praise Keats, don't they know, to Psyche about that seeing, the symmetry of I and I. And yet here, Shelley's already playing upon this exact tension, the seeing and the sight, the green and purple seaweeds. I mean, only Wordsworth, right, would want to write a line that spells out the colours of the seaweed. And then, just as you're resting, I sit upon the sands alone. The simplicity, the way in which you feel that this could be a Lucy poem line, that is quite incredible to me. That, like Steve said about the kind of aliveness to illusion, that I think is quite astonishing work. And so I suppose what Shelley made me think in these challenging times was how much you can do with dejection, how much we're capable of thinking, feeling, and the electric life that can be packed into something that feels so apparently simple, but yet is so active beneath a beautifully polished surface. So I suppose, Amanda, what I've learned in reading Shelley is that I have the equivalent of some sort of overstimulation when I start reading him, because I'm aware, I suppose, as all of us are, two things at once: the excitement of seeing something done so brilliantly. Byron talks about poets as craftsmen, doesn't he? And here we see Shelley does not argue with his tools, but also the stillness of taking part in a mood that is created so carefully and so beautifully and so completely, where lines like, I could lie down like a tired child and weep for the life of care, which I have borne and yet must bear. So close to the edge of mawkish, we can feel Levis weeping in the aisle with Shelley, can't we? At someone daring to speak with a voice that is theirs, and yet, the confidence, competence, and exceptional level of control that we see shows us a poet entering into not just maturity, but into mastery. That's enough, I think, for me.
No, thank you. Speaking of mastery of that poem in particular, I think one of the last conversations I had with Michael O'Neill, another great late editor of Shelley, was on stanzas written in dejection, and in particular how peculiar a poem it was, especially in its use of pronouns, a topic of Shelley's poetry, which of course Michael was a leading voice on. So after that conversation, I've long reflected on this poem's peculiarity, and reading the commentary to this poem in this edition offered me a new perspective, certainly in the revelation, which to me was a great discovery of yours, Nora, that a companion within the poem, like Dorothy in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, was edited out. Something of the oddness of this poem clicked into place for me after that reading experience and having this awareness of an omitted auditor. And Nora, your commentary that this poem foreshadows Shelley's declaration in 1822 that if the past and the future could be obliterated, the present would content me, absolutely struck me, and certainly I think accords with the volatility of our contemporary moment. So Nora and Steve, I don't know if you want to come in and speak about your own personal reactions to, as readers, as editors of Shelley in this volume.
Well, okay, Steve, I just wanted to say that I mean, it was when I was reading over your editing of what's actually a poem that's often thought of just a vicious little lampoon, and it's called To S and C, meaning to Sidmouth and Castlereagh, and it's one of the Angry Peterloo poems. And he compares these two statesmen to the nastiest things he can know. And perhaps the culminating bit is when he says that they are like, as a shark and dogfish wait under an Atlantic isle for the Negro ship whose freight is the theme of their debate, wrinkling their red gills the while. I just suddenly that hit me, that verse. And it's so incredibly sinister and nasty, and it sort of detonated something that had been building up a very long time. I've become increasingly involved in learning more about the abolition of slavery as it affected the Romantics. And it's been a sort of personal odyssey, which takes me back to my own roots. And it gathered momentum all these years. And, Steve spoke of the sharks actively lurking. And he pointed out the significance of that word under. Because they did lurk under the isles. There was particular isles they used to lurk for the slave ships. And then it coalesced with another in 2022, when I met the late lamented Benjamin Zephaniah, dub poet, really an important poet and Shelley lover, and a passionate Shelley lover. And it was thanks to the BBC radio programme, Percy Shelley, Reformer and Radical, which is still available on iPlayer, and which Bishop Coffey made happen. I mean, he pitched at the BBC and wrote the script and organised things. And it would have happened. I think it's the only tribute to Shelley that actually appeared in the media during that anniversary year, bicentenary year of his death. And Maddie and I both took part in it. And he was truly passionate about the Mask of Anarchy, which spoke to him personally. And there was an instant sense of fellowship between us because he's Jamaican, his mother was Jamaican, and so on. And then within a year he was dead, and he died of the same kind of tumor that killed Stuart, which is, so sad and ironic. And I remember asking him rather mischievously if he didn't sometimes think that Shelley might have done more good if he had been a member of Parliament. And he said, "No, man, being a poet was what he was good at." And I just love that. And he came and visited our house once. He collected Shelley editions, I found out, and he brought some of his treasures to the studio and said he wanted to read more of Shelley's prose. So when on the occasion he visited the house after Christmas 2022, we actually gave him a present of an 1847 containing Shelley's prose. And I just want to share these pictures with you because I don't think they haven't been seen before. And that's him opening the box containing this edition, and his look of surprise. It really should be read from right to left rather than the other way round. And then he realized what it was, and he put his thumbs up to say, "Thumbs up to Shelley." And they weren't posed at all. They're absolutely genuine. And then he performed one of his poems there. It was just, I just feel we could have developed into real friends. But I mustn't reminisce about that. But it's something, I also took me into an area of finding out about why Shelley should have been thinking so much, should have produced that image in that time, and found that he'd had to have been reading about the Haitian Revolution. But that's another story. Anyway, this will go on, and it's one of just many, many things that happened to me during that time that I was editing this volume. I've learned so much from everybody. I mean, just hearing the two of you, Maddie and Amanda, talk about dejection, it just reminds me how much I get from all of you, and you've said some things that I've never thought about, dejection, and so it goes on. It's a fountain of delight, this poetry.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks so much for sharing those photos of Benjamin with us all. I think we'll all go away treasuring them, certainly. Steve, were there any personal discoveries that you care to share during the course of editing or reading this edition?
Well, I discovered that I have more patience than I thought I did. Let me give you an anecdote that might illustrate this. Years ago, when I had my first chance to look at Shelley's notebooks and materials at the Bodleian, I was reading the manuscript of the preface to Adonais, and there's a stanza that he was, or a paragraph that he was working on in there that was excised. He never used it. But it's when he begins defending himself against what he calls the calumnies that have been thrown against him. And the manuscript is just peppered with false starts and cross-outs. And in the midst of this absolute mess on the page, right in the middle, untouched, is "I wish to be left alone." And then it goes back to all the cancellations and the overwriting. And I've never forgotten that moment where I was able to sort of be there with Shelley in the midst of this tremendous stressful self-defense that he was writing. And he just had that moment of saying, just to hell with it all, leave me alone. But he didn't put it into his final product. He knew how to blow off the steam that way. And this is something I think that I've discovered, but I'll go back to the sense of fun. These little comic touches that turn up remind me of the story of how he used to, as a younger man, go off to have his lunch and take bits of bread and ball them up into tight little balls and fire them out from behind a book in front of himself at other people. And I love the image. I love the image of this. We don't think of our poets as people who have fun. We don't think of them going out, and just goofing off in that way. We take them very seriously. It's like the image that we have, so many of us have, of Keats as this poor fey spirit wasting away, coughing. And then we see what happened at the famous dinner party, where they bustled Lamb off into the next room. And he's out doing all this stuff in the city. He's not just sitting in a little room coughing away. I think working on this project, more than anything else I've done with Shelley, has put me in touch with what I think is the poet that I'm discovering there, the real human being. And that seems to me to be what you want to get. In teaching Dickens over the years, I used to teach Tale of Two Cities, and students often grumbled about how slow it moves. And of course, I finally realized you have to realize who's telling the story. He's an elderly man with a story to tell, and he's just taking his time telling it. And working at this granular level with Shelley's poems has forced me to just slow down, relax, and get in there, look at it, listen to it, try to work along with him and figure out what's going on. And it's made me a much better reader, not just of Shelley, but of text generally. And that's been very pleasant.
Thank you, Steve. I absolutely agree. We need more of the fun and the goofy Shelley. That would be fantastic to have coming up. Speaking of discoveries, so shifting the focus, I suppose, from personal discoveries to more textual discoveries in relation to this edition, we've had a question in the chat already, and it's one that I think we were going to discuss anyway, so quite appropriate. But the question in the chat, there's no name attached to it, but it says, "It seems to me one aspect of editing is discovering new things, no matter how small they might seem, nevertheless exciting." And they ask if you could offer, Nora and Steve, if you could offer an example of a discovery in the course of your editing on this volume that particularly delighted or surprised you.
Well, I have a slew of little discoveries, but why don't you continue what you were saying, Steve, about discovering things? Because you've talked about you've discovered things, your own patience, but and you know, sort of you slow down, you pay attention to the poems. But were there any sort of discoveries, perhaps of more of a kind of oh, I never knew that, or I hadn't realized this, or something like that, because I certainly found them.
Well, I can remember one incident where I was working on a passage, and I'm not even sure that this was on this volume, but Shelley says something about mind, M-I-N-D. And I always wondered if he was using it generically, lowercase mind, or if it was something more elevated, like he was trying to allegorize the term. And I remember finally finding it in a manuscript. And of course, I didn't solve the problem because there is mind written. The first letter does rise above the level of the other levels, but it's not a full capital. But it's clearly not the way he usually begins a word that begins with an M. And making that sort of call at that point that yes, he is indeed talking about it as mind, uppercase mind, changed how I was reading the particular line I was working on. I just can't place where it was that I ran across that. It might very well have been in looking at something else that was related to some of the manuscript materials I was looking at it for this volume.
Yeah.
But I mean, little things that you find in looking at the manuscripts and getting a look at the process that's involved and how these things involved. And then you start to, Nora is great for this. She gets into the slight variations in the colors of the ink and when he changed to a new nib for the pen and all this sort of thing. It's just a level of detective work that's incredible, and I'm in awe of her because that would drive me right up the wall you see behind me.
Yeah, well, you're not always able to, noticing when Shelley dips his pen doesn't always mean anything. It just meant the pen ran out, or, and he had to take another dip. But I've blown the cover of the person who asked about discoveries. It's Lisa Vargo. And anyway, I hope you're listening, Lisa. Because I talk about some of the little discoveries, because we promised discoveries in the blurb, and do we deliver? I think some people might want to know. Well, I wouldn't say there are any new Shelley poems hidden in an attic that we found, but I'll just read off a few of these that we did. And there's a Mary Shelley transcript supposedly lost since 1877, but hiding in plain sight in the Berg Library, New York. And Liz Denlinger went and looked at it, and we put our data together, and lo and behold, yeah, identified it. It was the lost transcript. So that was one thing. And then there are quite a few discoveries centered around the Cenci, Shelley's own, that I've talked about. And just before the conference in 2022, such a lot was happening around then. An auction sale came up with an unknown copy with 4 corrections in Shelley's hand. And they were definitely genuine. And the copy had belonged to a famous collector called Stevens Cox. And Liz Denlinger of the Pforzheimer Library, she bid for it. And it's now joined another copy of the Cenci, also with Shelley corrections that had belonged to Shelley's friend John Taft. Well, we don't know who this new copy belonged to. He mightn't have given it to anybody, but it's rather suspicious that the flyleaf has disappeared. So I think somebody ripped it out for an autograph. And that had come up, the first one, the Taft copy, had come up for sale in 1986. And these are very small. Sorry, when Mike Rossington was working, editing the Cenci for the Longman edition, he had been able to incorporate the Taft correction. So lightning struck twice. You know, when you're editing the Cenci, manuscripts pop up. And anyways, to be serious, I'm convinced that there are more of these sorts of things around that nobody knows about and which suddenly appear. And, you know, you just have to keep your eyes skinned about this. And the sharp-eyed person in this case was Bysshe Coffey, who saw it. He gets auction feeds and he spotted this was going. Anyway, they're very good corrections, even though there are only a few of them. And they just show again how careful Shelley was in actually twiddling about with an individual line until, you know, he obviously suddenly saw something, this could be better, and he'd put it in. So we have incorporated them into our text. And then when, as working with Stuart on the appendixes to the Cenci, I came across an untapped mind of earlier versions of the Cenci story published in Germany between 1780 and 1810, including one that was translated into English in an English magazine of 1816. And it suggested would make a good play because it's like the story of the House of Atreus. Shelley thought, or said he thought, that it hadn't come to England yet. You know, did he know about it? There are a few things in Shelley's plays that are found in some of these German versions, though not in others, and that are not in his acknowledged source. Now, Michael Rossington always suspected that Shelley's plays had more than one source. I mean, the Cenci is supposed to have had only one source, and he thought, no, I think there's another. Could be, and I think, you know, I think we've managed to firm up his hunch. But there's still something new to sleuth because I don't know what that other source was. I haven't run that, so that's, you know, one door opens to another kind of mystery. And then this is the very first in publication, I think, to apply multispectral imaging to Shelley's manuscript. And I was invited by Michael Sullivan, who's doing some groundbreaking work in this line at Oxford, and I was invited to join him in his project of applying the technique to the recovery of modern manuscripts, not just medieval or other ancient manuscripts where it has been tried out, but modern ones. And it's very early days, but this volume contains 4 cases in which it's resulted in the firming up of a conjecture or the solving of a little crux. And so expect to hear more about this and the technique applied to other authors in the future. So, Michael, I see you're out there. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be part of this project. And multispectral imaging supports my view that Claire Clairmont played a much bigger role in Shelley's poetry than has been recognized. She's not been written out of his biography, of course, but she has out of his poetry, except for 2 poems. Now, it shouldn't matter who a poem was addressed to, should it? Because the addressee is always, in some sense, a figment of the poet's imagination. Yeah, but supposing somebody's thought that a poem has been, or everybody's thought that a poem has been as a lament for Harriet Shelley, or a lament for Fanny Godwin, or about estrangement from Mary Shelley, you know, then, and when it actually isn't about any of these things. At any rate, I'm convinced that there are 4 quite well-known short poems that were addressed to Claire, and 2 of them are in this volume. And finally, and perhaps the most important question of all, you know the poem lines written lines written on the lines written among the Euganean hills. There is some dispute about what hill the poet is on when he writes those lines, or is supposed to be writing those lines. Well, Stuart has absolutely clinched it. And his excellent note doesn't just illuminate why it matters, but it's a note that only he could have written, and it's just beautifully done. So, and there are other little discoveries, but those are among some of the things I thought I'd roll out past you.